Great to be with you all this afternoon. I'll ask all our panelists to come on up and join us. I'm also very conscientious of time, and I know that we're about all the standing between you and y'all. So we're going to move this along this afternoon. Introduce quickly our panel to you. We'll spend more time with him later today. But Peter Harnik, who you met a minute ago, gave us a great overview there, is joined today by Erik Meyers. Erik, good to see you, Vice President of Sustainable Programs for the Conservation Fund out of Arlington, Virginia. Thank you for coming down and being with us today. And locally, Thomas Farmer, who is our Director of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy here in Georgia. And Thomas has been involved in lots of great conservation programs and projects around the state over the last few years. So join me in welcoming our panel and talk about the relationship between the economy and between our parks. Right now, if you want to go talk to an elected official, the main thing they're going to want to talk to you about is job creation and economic development. That's what we talk about every day. As Commissioner at the Department of Natural Resources, it became very difficult over the last few years of trying to secure funding from the public sector in the midst of the recession that we're in. The only time that we were successful was when we could demonstrate that there was a direct correlation between the economy, economic development, tourism growth, and the conservation of the project that we were working on. And so the first question I have today, and Peter, we'll start with you, just work our way down, is talk to us a little bit about how your organizations are out there talking every day to the public sector, the private sector, about that relationship, that nexus between the economy, recovery, and conservation, and the roles that Greenspace and park space can play in recruitment and economic development. So, Peter, if you'll start us off.
Well, I've probably been talking too much already, but I'll just quickly say, first of all, I don't think we should say that parks are the solution to our nation's economic problems, because we're obviously just a tiny little part of this, and we shouldn't take this all on our shoulders that parks are going to solve everything. But one thing that we do, and there's a whole different talk that I have, but is we measure the amount of economic value that a park system actually brings to a city. And we do that by looking at tourism, park-related tourism. Like I mentioned with San Antonio, and it's true of many other places, much of tourism, people don't really think about it, but is related to parks, because activities occur in parks, festivals and sports events and all kinds of other things that occur in parks. So there's a lot of tourism that is park-related that is not really acknowledged to be. Property values that are increased because of park. The amount of money that people save by using their parks instead of having to join a gym or join a club or do all the other things that they get for free out of the park. So we take all these, plus the environmental factors, which have an economic value too. We take all these factors, do a study of each city, and come up with a number for how much economic value the park system of a city brings.
It's an interesting question, Chris, and I think where I sit here today representing several different organizations from around both statewide and Park Pride being one of them. We've had a small working group that has been working on looking at the economics of conservation, primarily because we want, if you remember back in 1998, all of you who lived here at the time, I hope, went and voted for the Heritage Fund, which was a statewide ballot measure that was intended to create a dedicated fund for land conservation. And I use big land conservation, I mean big umbrella. So big projects that Nature Conservancy is typically associated with, but also urban parks and everything in between. It did not pass, so we've spent the last 12 years in the proverbial wilderness trying to figure out how to get back to this public funding issue. And looking at other states and other places that have been successful in tackling this issue and getting that kind of sustainable funding, they've couched their efforts in economics. And I agree with Peter, we're not here to solve the world, but I think when the world's problems, but when I think you look at, for instance, Chris, $620 million in economic impact annually with just our state parks, 7,000 jobs. And that's Now you're starting to talk to the business community, you're starting to talk to the legislators down at the Gold Dome, and they start to take notice. And that's one of the things that we have to do a better job is producing those kind of statistics that really get to what we're talking about. That's good for the economy.
Well, I can't disagree with anything that has been said. In fact, the Conservation Fund was founded 25 years ago on the premise of both a mission on environmental protection on the one hand and on sustainable economic development on the other. So we've always seen the integration of conservation and economic goals going hand in hand and are looking constantly for those solutions. One of the approaches that we've advocated over the years is a strategic conservation green infrastructure approach. And this involves an integrated managed system of lands. Parks are part of it, natural areas, greenways obviously as connecting areas, blueways. And the reason for that is because that provides the essential services, the clean water, the clean air, there goes my microphone, the recreation that we all depend on, that everything else is built on. So in order to get smarter development, you need to start with smarter conservation so that you can pay up front to do things well on a green infrastructure basis and create the basis for your growth patterns, or you can pay later to, as Atlanta's experiencing now, trying to restore much of the green infrastructure, that essential green infrastructure. If you can do more of it up front in advance of development, you really get much more cost-efficient development as a result. Projects, stormwater management, water quality, just to name two of them, that don't cost as much as re-engineering this hard gray infrastructure would cost you. If you do your gray infrastructure well, utilizing the green infrastructure approach, you can create a tremendous number of co-benefits out of getting the two in place at once.
Yeah, one more point, Chris. I think Peter made a great presentation about health and parks, and in the research that my colleagues and I have been doing, and let me be clear, it's not empirical research we've been gathering. Georgia is the 15th most obese state in the country. So when you start talking about what the costs are, the direct healthcare costs to us, and primarily, and I don't know this for certain, but I would assume that the majority of those costs are going to fall on the companies that provide health care in our state. To many of us, we're looking at that coupled with our population growth, $11 billion by 2018 is what those direct costs would be. I think this is an issue that we have to address now. And Peter, all the points that Peter made in his presentation, I think are really relevant to what we're trying to do.
I'll give you a statistic that keep you on that. If you look at the research that was done, I believe it was in 2009 now, that looked at obesity rates of young people around this country. The good news is that Georgia wasn't the worst. Thank God for Louisiana. Anybody that said that one time, somebody said, well, I'm from Louisiana. We got work for you. The bad thing is that Georgia is 24% of our young people in this state are medical obese. So that's something for us to think about as we continue. I want to go a little further in the conversation about the public sector and the private sector just for a moment. We have spent a lot of time, I think traditionally, for our parks, for state parks and conservation areas, we've relied upon the public sector to fund those efforts. But right now, with the limited resources you have at the state and at the local level, it's harder and harder to do that. I'd like to hear you guys again, we'll just kind of go down the line here, talk a little bit about some best practices and what you're seeing, both pro and con, of how we do this public-private partnership, how we bring in the private sector, give them benefit, and make it worthwhile for them to invest in our parks, while at the same time maintaining all the things that are good about our parks and the reason that we go there. So, Peter, if you'll kick us off.
Well, I'm the kind of person who thinks that the public sector should be bearing the brunt on this, and we should keep pushing for that. But and like you said, the resources aren't there. The resources aren't there for two reasons. One reason is the economic collapse parks and the impacts on all of our funding sources from that. And the other is the gradual erosion of people's willingness to pay taxes. So I think, as people who love parks, we should be part of the movement to make sure that we pay enough taxes to keep up our infrastructure and our cities and make it beautiful and places to live and places to be proud of and everything like that. Having said that, there is the reality of the Tea Party and everything else that's going on right now, and hopefully that's somewhat of a short-term or medium-term situation that we can maybe get on top of in the not-too-distant future. But, actually, I think it's relatively easy to get the private sector to help out with many parks, more so than many other needs. Sometimes I feel guilty about other types of human needs that are harder to get the private sector to sign on to. Practically everybody likes to be associated with something beautiful and something desirable. And from what I've been able to see from Millennium Park, and Millennium Park in Chicago is the most expensive park ever built in this country. It cost $475 million, of which $275 million was raised privately. And of course, those companies get their names on things. They drew the line. They wouldn't let McDonald's have golden arches in the park, but they got their name on the bicycle pavilion, and Wrigley got its name in other places. So there's a little bit of that, but I'm not sure that's really the end of the world. I think that we can do very well. I know we've been doing it at Piedmont Park, partnering with private entities and wealthy individuals to make great parks or to keep them up. Hopefully that's not a long-term solution, but a stopgap solution.
Well, I would agree with Peter. I think there's something of a layer cake of funding that's necessary these days, which we heard it referred to as collaboration earlier today, and I think that's absolutely true. We need groups like Park Pride and pulling in the partners that they can bring in from the business community to help both create and to maintain these spaces over time. It's the ongoing stewardship and all of the activity programming here that you were talking about that provides a great opportunity, I think, for some of the private sector entities to get involved, for some of the businesses, the hospitals, you name it, to get involved in the parks. And I think that's a great way to view how that public-private benefit could work. Like Peter, I would hope that we could get to a point where there's an ongoing dedicated source of funding for acquisition, for providing the basics, providing the bones of the park, and on that can be built using private funds, more of the activity and the ongoing stewardship.
Agreed. I think it's, Chris, it's a leadership issue, and I think that our public leaders ought to recognize the value that a little bit of money and what can leverage. So if you put the public funds in, I think we'll find that we can leverage a lot more money. And there's plenty of examples in the state where we've been able to find that leverage. I do think, Peter's point, at some point we need to be better marketers. We need to be able to provide better opportunities for the businesses in our state to get involved, and if it's naming something, I think those are small places where we can make exceptions. That's going to entice the business community to get more involved. Hey, great.
That dedicated funding. We've been talking about this on the call, the prep for that, so it's a little bit of a curveball, but I think that's one of the things that has been frustrating at the state level for all of you, is that there's not that dedicated source of funding coming to us to preserve green space and preserve these special places. So I'd like to hear from you, Peter, what are you seeing in other states, other cities of dedicated funding sources? And Thomas, maybe you can jump in about what are some ideas here in Florida.
Yeah, well, Minnesota just in the last round enacted a new dedicated source of funding. Well, I guess it was before that, but the first projects have been authorized in recent weeks. Worked with a whole coalition of folks, including Nature Conservancy and a number of other organizations, to pull off one of the largest working forest land conservation deals. It's the largest conservation opportunity the state ever had in Minnesota, and that was because it had a dedicated funding source. Now, and this was in the midst of post-2007, looking at the downward trends in the height of the recession, the voters enacted that in 2008. I think there's still that opportunity out there if the questions are posed in the right way with an understanding of what those resources can do. And Chris, when you started this off and you phrased this in terms of jobs and the economic generator that these funds can be in terms of the parks and this green space, I think people will get it. I know there are other sources. When I talked about co-benefits earlier, I'm also thinking of lesser-known sources, the sewerage agencies, for example, or the water departments that have a rate base. To the extent that their solutions in terms of protecting source waters or in terms of reducing flooding, controlling CSO overflows, controlling stormwater generally, to the extent that those can be driven out of a rate base, there's a real opportunity to realize co-benefits of locating park resources that serve the people in recreational terms and aesthetics, in addition to getting those stormwater. So you've got the funding built in that way. But beyond that, it would be nice to see a dedicated source at the state level. The states that have that, the localities that have built into their systems tend to have a better system of parks. We've been implementing a Greenbelt program. We, the Conservation Fund, I should clarify, working with the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan, on creating a greenbelt of working farms and parklands with a millage that the voters of Ann Arbor passed and have reaffirmed on 2 separate occasions. That's remarkable, but that's the vision that community has for itself and what it wants to see itself grow out to be. It wants to see a working ring of farms. It identifies with an agrarian past, and it wants to make sure that's part of its future as well.
What was the exact vote? Wisconsin, Minnesota. What did they actually vote on? What did they vote to tax?
It is. I will have to get back to you on that. Yeah, it's you know that.
Looking at Andrew, property tax increase?
Sales tax.
And so it's
Sales tax statewide.
Right.
Yeah.
And large organizations as well as.
Agriculture, water.
Right.
Thank you.
There's 2 kinds of dedicated funding. There's dedicated funding where the populace votes on a bond issue, and generally those do pretty well. Their passage rates is 60, 70, 80% because people love parks and people are willing to spend money on parks. Then there's dedicated funding where, and I pretty much only follow cities, but where the city council delegates a certain percentage of the tax revenue, like the property tax revenue, to the Parks Department, and that's in perpetuity. And there's a couple of cities that have that. Minneapolis is pretty much the main city that has a dedicated tax that the city council can't touch. Now, of course, politicians really hate a situation like that because it removes X% of their income from their deliberations. So it's very interesting to see that when you give it to the general public, they'll vote 60, 70, 80% in favor. If you try and craft a bill in a city council, it's very, very hard to pass that because they're protecting their own ability to make those decisions. I don't know, the Minneapolis situation dates back to 1883. I don't know if that could be done today anywhere or not. There's a few other cities that get a portion of their property tax. Los Angeles gets a portion of the property tax, but that allows the city council to say, well, you're getting this much automatically, so we're going to cut the rest to balance that out. So it doesn't really add up being any differently than the average city. The whole thing is based on politics. Groups like Park Pride on the local level, and then groups like the City Parks Alliance on the national level would be the groups to lead an effort to do that. It's purely a political issue. You can get to 51% of the vote, you can get there, but you have to build a really strong campaign and get everybody who loves parks involved in it.
Thomas, what's going on here?
perfect opportunity. So, Peter's right. There does need to be a concerted effort and a campaign put together. And under the, at the expiring former DNR Commissioner Noel Holcomb, and then also when Chris was at his time at DNR, the commissioners, those two commissioners urged a few organizations, I won't list them all because I fear I'll forget some folks, but the Nation Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, Conservation Fund, my friends at the Georgia Wildlife Federation, Park Pride, the Georgia Conservancy, and I think almost most interestingly, the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia. We have been meeting for more than 2 years now, working on several things. One, looking at what other states have done. And I'm embarrassed I couldn't remember Minnesota's funding source, but Iowa's another state that just in this past fall, I mean, Georgia's conservative, Iowa's more conservative. They just passed a sales tax, dedicated sales tax provision that will allow them hopefully to do some good things. But what we are doing is coming up with, one, a case statement to really talk about, again, as we've talked about a little bit already, the conservation, the economics of conservation and what it means to the state in language that not only politicians will understand, but also the business community. We've made great strides, and we're getting ready to be in a position where we're going to release those findings publicly. And then we're also creating a website where folks can come on and leave us their names and addresses and donate if you want to. But really, what we're trying to do is begin the process of broadening this tent, because it's going to have to be a grassroots, statewide effort. That is not, and I think our thinking is it needs to be you all that are in touch with your legislators. Trust me, I work at the Capitol quite often. They're tired of hearing me talk about it. I need to get Chris Clark, as president of the Chamber of Commerce, on my team and saying, yeah, this is what we want to do. And I think Chris is there. He's got some members that might not be, but we'll have the dialogue. I think it'll be an interesting time. But again, as I said earlier, our goal is to get back to that Heritage Fund idea where we can put something on the ballot that will dedicate a significant amount of money that we can do interesting things around the state. And by that, I mean urban parks and playgrounds. The agricultural community is a big part of this. We need to be able to talk about agricultural easements and the decline in farmland around our state, as well as the things that the Nature Conservancy and some conservation funds care about, whether it's water protection in the North Georgia mountains or protecting the Altamaha River down in South Georgia. So I say this as a plug, but I hope I'm preaching to the choir. But we're going to be looking for your organizations and places where we can roll this out and to speak more in detail and in depth about what we want to do here in the state, because I think it will benefit all of us, and that's the message we need to carry. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tom. So, there have been 2 votes in the last really 4 years by local communities in Georgia to tax themselves on bonds and Paulding Forest. I think it was 85 to 90% of the public has been voted on, and then down for Silver Lake, 90% of the rural community that we thought we needed to get close to that, all voted in favor of taxing themselves. So you're right, the will is there. We just got to get the will.
We did a poll after the election, after this past November, because we wanted to get a snapshot of where Georgians were on this topic. We're still at 88% support of this type of effort. That's a big number, particularly when you're looking at the frustration that was happening with the electorate leading up to November 5th. So Georgians care about this stuff. We just got to get our message right and count everything.
I think that's a remarkable number, at 88%.
Right.
The only thing I've seen poll that high is the poll that we did that showed 89% of Georgians favored Sunday sales. He's on track to that. So we're looking now to open it up. Do you have any questions from the floor for our panel?
This question
for Peter, how do you prevent car creep? And I know you mentioned how Piedmont Park is a model for removing cars out of the park. And on Saturday, I counted at least 20 cars driving in the park, including 2 police cruisers going at about 20 miles an hour. There was a huge dump truck, and this is all new policy. I actually stopped one of the policemen and I said, you know, it used to be y'all had bicycle patrols or foot patrols. And he says, well, we've been given the code, so we can now come through the park whenever we want to. How does a community be able to prevent and there are a lot of special events, they all get permits to have cars, and so for pedestrians and cyclists and people walking their dogs or, you know, kids and strollers are now having to compete in that situation. How does one prevent that?
Well, I mean, I don't know the specifics of your situation, but basically you need to organize the community around it. Find people who agree with you and start a little campaign and talk to people in the park and say, wouldn't this be a lot nicer if we didn't have cars to deal with? I'm not sure if you're talking about a car-free park that people are getting all these extra permits to go into, or a park that's actually being driven through all the time with cars.
No, it's a car-free, it's supposedly a car-free park.
Well, I mean, that should be relatively easy where it's already a car-free park. Because I know how hard it is to get cars out of parks where they're allowed to drive through it. But, I mean, start with letters to the editor and do a petition drive of people in the park. You want allies, you want to feel strong, you don't want to feel like you're the only person that's worried about it. I'm sure lots of people will come up to you and say, thank God, somebody else will notice that this is driving me crazy. You'll have a wonderful time.
Y'all talked a lot about the need for the basic resources for revenue streams to make things happen. And I come out of the park background, and I know my biggest challenge was getting that basic infrastructure in place and the management forward on a long-term basis. So as we look in Georgia, you know, Peter talked about the bond referendum, but typically that has specific construction goals for specific projects and acquisitions. It doesn't really deal with that long-term strategy of building a system, of creating maintenance, and making it happen. So as we look forward to the possible new funding stream at the state level for the state of Georgia, are you looking at that basic management aspect?
The answer is I don't know, but here's what I think. We're working feverishly at getting the funding. The experts, you know, that deal with parks and you know, planning and strategy, I think it's going to be up to you all to provide that input on what that program may look like. You know, the pie, I think in order to get something passed, we'll need to be divided somewhat, and that's okay. I think we'll make it work. But I don't sit here as an expert on how to best use that money. And I think we're going to need input from the relevant specialists that will direct how those funds are spent. I think it's just the main thing is it's important that it's transparent. And that legislators and the general public can understand and see how those funds are spent.
I will say there was a bill that unfortunately didn't make it crossover this year that would allow us to levy a percentage fee for parks, for economic development, for parks, and part of that, at least the earlier version of that bill, it did allow for some operational support in that. One more question. Yes, sir.
With the lack of funding that's available for parks, it makes sense, and you touched on it a minute ago, or a little bit ago, about bringing kind of corporate, almost sponsorship kind of into parks, you know, where people are looking to give money, but they need the recognition as well to go with it, like McDonald's putting, you know, the golden arches in a park. Where would you see a proper balance being where parks are still a place where you're able to escape without turning it into, a mall full of, billboards and advertisements and bright, flashy colors and stuff. You can still keep that natural character, but still getting that private funding.
I can give you the high end of what's inappropriate. I saw a piece in the news earlier this year that the UK had put up, with its change in government, so the United Kingdom had put up for sale Sherwood Forest. Believe it or not. And I thought at first it was a line out of The Onion or something, a joke. But it turned out, in fact, Sherwood Forest was for sale until outraged citizens said, "You've got to be kidding us." And the government reluctantly and shamefacedly removed Sherwood Forest from sale. But you're right, there's a limit. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I think you do need to watch both the extent of private investment, and also it goes back to the point about paying attention for the long-term sustainability of the park resources that we have. Just setting up a park in the first place is not necessarily a guarantee in these times that the park will always be there. So, a robust fund, robust sets of partnerships that understand what the park is all about. I don't know, Peter, you may have more views on the commercialization aspect of it. I know Chicago went through, they had all kinds of guidelines with Millennium Park in terms of what they would do and wouldn't do, and it was a little bit about what money was available, but there were also some hard stops on some of the things they wouldn't permit in there in terms of signage and some appropriate recognition that everybody was the same at some point, so you had to spend a lot more. I guess I don't have any hard and fast rules for you, but to say that there is a limit to it. Central Park has a number of corporate sponsors as well, and again, Central Park Conservancy has developed some well-established rules for what those partnerships look like.
I will say, having started that process at DNR, vilified by much of the media because they thought I was going to rename all the state parks, Budweiser State Park, Donald State Park. I think part of what we decided was you look at, make sure that the philosophy of the companies that want to partner with you are in line with the philosophy that you want to do, whether that's health benefits, and to try to restrict that the product placement or the signage around what's already been developed. Don't go off on your trails, don't go off in the middle of your lake, don't go off and try to give them more than what they really need. Most companies you'll find, I think, are very, they don't want to be seen as overreaching. They want to do what is right, and I think it's just you have to make sure that everybody's at the table and working on it together, because I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. Will y'all join me in thanking our panel?